All right. Well, I think this is interview number 4, I believe. Last time we had Ken, which is your business partner. Today we have the one and only Jeff Singleton. So Jeff, I'll let you take it and fill everyone in on how you and I got connected and what you've been doing in the accessibility space.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so we've been James and I, we've been what communicating back and forth for almost 2 years now. Is that right? I think.
Something like that. It's been a little while. Yeah.
Yeah, but from what I remember, you came to us. I don't remember how you got introduced to us, but I remember you came expressing some interest in accessibility, and of course, we're always excited to talk about accessibility with people that, especially those that are taking an interest in it. And so we've been sharing our knowledge over the last few years, and seen you actually grow quite a bit in your knowledge and skill set. So
Yeah, we met when I was just learning what the WCAG was and
yeah,
ARIA and how to actually put it into a website instead of just talk about it. And
yeah,
we've had almost weekly conversations inside of WebAlign. You're asking me questions, I'm asking you questions. It's my go-to sort of catch all of like I've been banging my head against the keyboard for a day and a half. Wednesday comes along, I'll just ask Jeff and Ken.
yeah.
And so fill everyone in on what WebAlign is, what Converge Accessibility is. Ken gave us his rendition of it, but curious to hear yours, and also if you want to include your background before Converge, just to sort of complete the puzzle.
Sure, yeah. So I started in accessibility probably around, well, actually, when I went to work for Microsoft in early 2000s. I think it was 1999, 2000, something like that. Eventually, I ended up in their assistive technology group. But before I ended up there, I was doing a lot of UI testing at Microsoft for their the network. I was with the network group at the time. And I think the first time I realized I was doing any kind of accessibility work is it was either Windows XP or Windows 2000. There was the RAS server portion of the UI, the remote access server. And I had to sit down in front of about 2 or 3 people and show them how I could go through that interface using only the keyboard and be able to configure things and do all the different tasks that were available with that. And I walked away thinking, oh, what was all that about? And of course, later on, I learned it was to make sure that we were applying by the Section 508, which was something that we had to make sure we were looking at the time. So that was my first introduction to accessibility, and from there I did end up in the accessible technology group at Microsoft at the time, working with the Windows narrator screen reader. So that's where I started to get a little bit more into that. And then when I left Microsoft, I ended up going to work actually with Ken. We were working for a Washington, D.C. firm doing some consulting work for the Veterans Health Administration. Veterans Health Administration. And from there, of course, we focused primarily on Section 508. And then eventually we moved on into other projects together at different companies and started getting in more into the WCAG, the WCAG 1.0, 1.1, and all that. And that's what we've been focused on ever since. So Ken and I have been working together now, let's see, it's 2024, probably about 17 years, I guess. It doesn't seem that long, but it really has been
Time,
that long.
time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. And so since then, I mean, we've been primarily, both of us have been primarily been focused on the digital accessibility area. From that time back before it was even popular, now there's a lot more focus and there's a lot more discussion around digital accessibility now. But back then we were, there was very few people. It was a very small group. You almost knew everybody that was working in that field. And since then, we worked together for a long time. We worked for a company that had actually a really good accessibility scanner for a long time, but unfortunately, that ended up falling out of favor because they didn't keep up with it. And as such, when the pandemic came around, Ken and I found ourselves in a position to either change course career wise, or find somebody else to go to work for. And we decided, we had a lot of ideas on our own. So let's give it a try. So we started our own consulting firm, because we do tend to work well together, even though people always claim that we bicker like a married couple. But I think that's probably part of the recipe that works for us. It's just how we're able to see things from different aspects. I can see things from more of the testing user side, where Ken likes to see things from the policy legal side. So I think coming together like that, it really kind of gives us a unique view. And since then, that's when we did that. One of the first things we did is we started working on WebAlign. And where WebAlign came about is when we would have do different reviews and we would have calls with customers. One of the first things we would hear, or one of the things that we would hear quite often, especially from developers, was, well, just tell me what I need to do. They really didn't want to understand so much why it was important, or all the details behind it, or how you got to that point. They just needed to know, what do I need to do? And most of the training out there and the resources out there went into a lot of background. So the purpose of WebAlign was to be able to focus in on a specific accessibility principle and explain what it means and how to apply it quickly, so that user or the developer could take it and turn around and apply it without having to learn a whole lot of background on it. One of the other things we did with WebAlign at that point is we thought, okay, let's take all these web content success criteria, which can be confusing, especially if you're new to it, and break it down into core concepts. And so that's what we did, is we realized that some of these criteria can have up to 5 or 7 different aspects that you actually have to look at to order to really meet that success criteria, or to check for that success criteria. And so that's what those core concepts do. They make it more granular, and then we're able to discuss that. And then we took it a step further, and instead of just focusing on what the developer needs to know, we focused on, okay, if I'm a designer, what do I need to know about this? If I'm a content creator or graphics or multimedia creator, what do I need to know? If I'm a tester, how do I go about testing for this? I don't necessarily need to know how to design for it or code for it, but I need to validate it, right? So that's what WebAlign really does. It takes all that information and puts it into one resource that you can go to if you have a question on a specific success criteria, and figure it out quickly and make use of it.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of people that have used it just to learn about WCAG. So
I know I definitely did the first time I read. I think it was WCAG 2.1 is where I jumped in. The first time I read it, I got to the end of reading the success criteria, and I didn't remember. I was just reading to read it. None of it actually stuck. And then getting into the Wednesday WebAlign calls, going into the WebAlign tool, looking at some of the pre-production stuff that happens usually in your Figmas or your wireframing and your prototyping, looking at the production stuff, putting it into any web builder, whether it's custom, it's WordPress, Shopify, Squarespace, Wix, Webflow. It can apply to all of those. You don't necessarily develop on something like Squarespace, but you design, you pick what the link text should be in your links, you pick your form fields and put the labels in. So being able to apply all of that from the design stage all the way through the testing stage, and knowing exactly how it applies, because you look at something like info and relationships and you're like, okay, information, structure, and relationships have to be programmatically determined. What does that mean? And when I teach people, when I get to success criteria like that, I always have to stop and explain, what does programmatically determined mean? And you guys basically took all of the guesswork out of it, which is why all of the people that I train or teach, I try to get them to use WebAlign as well, because it just makes it so easy to understand what the goal or what the outcome should be to create that accessible user experience. And I've realized recently, because I've been doing a lot more designing than I have building, is how much of it I can account for in that design phase, and how much of the user experience part of the process happens in that design phase. And for me, user experience includes accessibility. It's not a separate component. It's a layer within the whole UX UI conversation.
Exactly. I think that's one of the things that a lot of designers are starting to realize today, because in the past it was always considered a developer issue, because the web content accessibility guidelines are primarily developer focused. So that was the obvious assumption. But really, the majority of those principles and criteria that you're trying to apply should be addressed by the designer and not the developer.
The developers aren't picking the colors and looking
That's
at
right.
the contrast. They're not. But so I'm going to ask you a question that I also asked Ken is what percent of accessibility can be accounted for in the design part of the process?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that, but off the top of my head, I would have to say, let me just run it through my head for a second here. I'm thinking you're looking at 70+% of it, just
You're
just grab a number out of the air.
The number I've seen is 80%. So
Yeah.
it took a little bit of prying to get it out of Ken, but we all came to relatively the same conclusion that it's more than half,
Oh, definitely.
which
Yeah.
is interesting because, like you said, a lot of people think accessibility on a website or an app is developer issues.
Yeah.
And so, like the conversation that I want to sort of unpack with you, because the way I understand it, both of us do a lot of testing. We're the ones giving a lot of feedback to business owners, executives, developers, designers, managers. So I want to get a little bit into the testing conversation to hopefully shed a little bit of light on what testing for accessibility looks like. With your background and all of the projects you're constantly traveling and doing things, what stack of assistive technology do you recommend a business to test their website or their application with to get to a degree of confidence that is acceptable? Because achieving 100% accessibility isn't really feasible with how diverse disabilities are in their severity, in their complexity, whatever that might look like. But how can what assistive technology should businesses be using to get to an 80-90% confidence level that what they're publishing is accessible?
Yeah. So as far as using specific assistive technologies, if you're a company and you just want to make sure your website's accessible, I don't believe that you really need to use an assistive technology, because for a number of different reasons. First of all, those assistive technologies like a screen reader, the purpose of those particular tools are to provide somebody access to the content on the website. So they do a lot more than just test. I mean, how could I say that? So there's a little bit of a learning curve with those screen readers. And even if you understand the basic principle of what the screen reader is doing, a lot of screen readers out there will auto adjust for different common issues that might show up in a web page. So they make some assumptions because what they're trying to do is make sure that the person that needs that information read out to them audibly can get that information. So sometimes they do make guesses, right? And because they do that, it can also mask or make it seem like a website might be more accessible than it truly is. And that might not seem like a big deal, except all the assistive technologies out there don't do the same. So you could have a number of different screen readers, and while say you're using JAWS, for example, and the page seems to be reading out fine, well, JAWS does a lot of kind of second guessing on those coding when it comes to making something accessible. Whereas if you go to a different screen reader, it may not do that. And so just because JAWS might read it out correctly doesn't mean it's coded correctly. And therefore, it's not really meeting the guidelines or those standards. And so
So
that's one of the reasons why I say, yeah, you shouldn't just jump in and use a screen reader.
So what screen readers would you recommend from a desktop and from a mobile standpoint for business owners, developers, designers to be aware of that people are commonly using?
Yeah, okay. So the most common ones you're going to encounter, obviously JAWS, if you're running on a Windows machine. There's also one called NVDA, which is the open source screen reader that you can get without JAWS. You have to pay for. NVDA you can get, and if you it's always nice to be able to donate to that effort as well, since it is open source. The other ones you're going to come across quite regularly is VoiceOver for anybody that might be using a Mac system. And then when it comes to the mobile devices, you're looking at Android TalkBack and iOS VoiceOver. So those are the ones that I would say you should primarily, if you're looking for the ones that your users are most likely to be using, those would be the ones. But again, they all work a little differently. And unless you're going to be working with them all the time, there might be more problems for you to test with than not.
That might be easier to just have somebody do it.
Yeah.
In some cases. But one thing I'll add to that is, because I've experienced this, and just as a forewarning, if you are listening to this and then you go get a screen reader, whether it's NVDA or JAWS or Narrator, or VoiceOver on a Mac, you can still use a mouse. Your mouse doesn't turn off when you turn the screen reader on. The number of people I've had call me frantic that they don't know how to turn it off is kind of surprising. But I would say the learning curve for a screen reader on a mobile device is slightly higher than it is on a desktop, because a lot of us are used to mouse and keyboard functionality. The mobile experience with the screen reader is significantly different because all of the touch gestures. So it's not a simple tap to open an app, you have to double tap it. So there's a lot of different gestures that you have to sort of get familiar with when it comes to screen readers on mobile devices. From a non-screen reader standpoint, let's talk for just a minute or two from a low vision, from a colorblind, from a mobility standpoint, and from a cognitive standpoint. Are there any tools or resources or anything like that that you recommend people look at or be familiar, know how to use when it comes to making websites accessible for those types of disabilities?
Yeah, sure. So one of the first things we look at when we're doing any kind of testing on a website is we'll do a keyboard only test pass. And the reason that is because a lot of assistive technologies rely on that keyboard accessibility to be there. And if it's not, it can impact how that assistive technology might work, whether it's, regardless of what that assistive technology is. So making sure that, and that, honestly, keyboard testing anybody can do if they understand what it is they're trying to accomplish. So one of the first things you got to do is set aside the mouse and resist the urge to touch the mouse. And then when you load the page, start tabbing through that page. This is on a desktop. You start tabbing through that page to make sure that you can visually track the focus at all times, wherever that current keyboard focus is. And when you do set focus to an interactive control, make sure that you can interact with that control using only the keyboard and complete, say for example, it's a calendar widget, can actually use that successfully using only the keyboard. And that is really such a basic test, but you will capture so many accessibility issues with that alone. And the other thing is, if you're using like an accessibility scanner, often all the issues you find doing keyboard only testing is you don't find with those scanners. And then the other thing you have to be aware of too with doing the keyboard testing is, with the responsive layout a lot of the websites have, you want to make sure that you're looking at, the website, say with your menu, when it's at a certain resolution, you're going to get those little menu links at the top. But if that gets a little bit too small, at some point, that's going to condense down into a little hamburger menu, right? So you want to be able to test both those, because what I've been noticing lately, it used to be that the hamburger menu would only show up when the website got really narrow or something like that. But anymore, I've seen where you get the hamburger menu on a sizable browser resolution, and then if you expand it just a little bit more, then that hamburger menu goes away. So you have to double check for those things as well, to make sure.
And that starts to get into the low vision side of the conversation with magnification, because the hamburger menu, I think it's, for me, usually with the monitor I have, usually 150% is where I see that threshold where it switches from a full navigation bar into the hamburger menu. So the 150%, 200, 400%, that's all going to be your magnification for low vision users. What tools do you use for checking things like color contrast?
Well, for color contrast, there's a number of different tools I rely on. I've been doing it so long now that when I look at a website, you can kind of tell, whether or not there's something questionable there. But one of my go-to tools would be the color contrast analyzer. And, that's freely available online. It's spelled, the British way, and, with a U in the word color, and analyzer as well. But that's a good tool to use because it has the picker and you can go in and dig in and select the colors, the foreground and the background colors to get that. But you have to be careful how you use that as well, because some colors on the web will pixelate. And so you have to if you're going to do that method, you kind of have to understand, okay, if I have a white background and it's a darker text, let me get the darkest color in that font, because you're zoomed in and you see all the colors pixelated.
Yeah.
And then you also have to worry about gradient backgrounds as well, right? So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to use the browser developer, what do they call that in the developer toolbar? So like if you're in Chrome or you're in Edge and you open up the developer toolbar and you take the selector to go to a particular element that has text, oftentimes what will happen is you'll get a pop-up and it'll tell you what the contrast ratio is for that text right there. So you can get that information easily that way. Another way to do it is to use scanning tools that are out there that can scan a website. The thing to be careful about using some of the scanning tools when it comes to contrast is once the page is rendered, it doesn't mean that what the scanning tool is seeing at the code level exactly matches. So I've seen examples of, say, white text on a dark blue background that will come up and it'll tell me that it's a failure based on the scanning tool. And the reason is because looking at the code, the scanning tool is seeing white text on a white background. It doesn't really find that blue background that you get once the page is fully rendered. So I don't rely 100% on those scanning tools for that.
Yeah, and some of those scanning tools, just to clarify if anybody isn't familiar with them, the main ones I'm aware of are Axe and Andy and Wave and Lighthouse are kind of the main four right now. Are there other ones that would be sort of at the top of your list that people are most frequently using, where they might experience those false positives with the color contrast or the keyboard focus or other things like that?
Yeah, Wave. I see that a lot with Wave. Lighthouse will do that as well. It really just comes down, the scanning tool, they're kind of dumb in the sense that they only check for what you tell them to check, right? It's just code. Either it's off and on type of thing, true or false. And so most of the tools don't go into a lot of detail as far as digging too deeply into that accessibility tree to match those things up. And the other thing you're looking at too is a lot of the scanning tools, when they render that page, they're not really rendering the page visually. They're rendering it, in this virtual tree and then trying to match everything up. So that's why it's not like it's a bad thing. It's just the nature of scanning tools.
Yeah, and what I've seen with that color issue with the false positive of white text on a white background is usually there'll be a div with a different class or an ID or something like that that's changing the color between the page background and the section background. So visually it is white text on a dark blue background, but the page background is set to white. And the scanning tool isn't picking up the div that has the dark blue background set to it. So it's all a CSS sort of illusion.
Yeah. And it could be just a background image that's being thrown in there. It could be due to absolute positioning. Who knows?
Yeah, most of the time it's CSS to blame.
Yeah, that's true.
So I want to get into the automated or sort of testing tool conversation. But there's one category I want to touch on before we sort of transition, which is cognitive. It's a big one that I get a lot of questions on when I'm doing accessibility training or talking to people about making things accessible. What is sort of your take on making a website accessible for cognitive disabilities, like something like ADHD, autism, becoming easily distracted or disoriented, things like that?
Yeah, so as far as becoming easily distracted, obviously things that are moving on the screen or you auto updating, flashing content, that's obvious, and that's pretty easy to determine when you look at the page. Either you see stuff moving around or you don't, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to other things like maybe the wording that's used on a page, a good example that's often given is you might go to a web page and it tells you to click the red button in the right corner of the site, and I've actually seen that kind of instruction given on pages before. And then when you actually reflow the page to where it's the mobile view, the button's no longer on the right; it's either at the top or the bottom. So,
Yeah.
so that's a good example of why you don't do that, because first of all, you're telling them, you're giving directions based on color. You're telling them the page location. You're not giving them the information they really need uh, to really make sure that all a broader range or spectrum of different users can access it and follow that guidance. Sometimes too, it's not often, but when I'm looking at a website, depending on the purpose of the site, I've seen situations where the language used on the site is at a very high level, and you stop and you think about, well, this site is really geared towards just the general public, in which case you have to think about people that have English as a second language, and all this kind of stuff. And so unless it's a site that's already expected to be kind of at that more complex wording and sentence structure, I might call that out, but that doesn't happen very often. And then one of the other things I'll always look for is, where it's mentioning color or location on the page and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's where the conversation of WCAG conformance, single, double, AAA conformance, for me becomes a little bit of a gray area. I don't know if you do this, but a lot of the websites that I'm testing or evaluating, I'll grab samples of the copy and put it through something like the SMOG readability to see what the reading level is, if it's graduate level, college, high school level, middle school level, elementary school level, just to get an idea. Because while a lot of those are AAA success criteria, abbreviations, unusual words, industry terms, technical terms, things like that, those are what increase that difficulty. And providing a definition list or a glossary, or instead of abbreviating it every single time, spelling it out once and putting the abbreviation in parentheses the first time you use it. There's little things like that. Sure, they're AAA success criteria, but they're so easy to implement. It doesn't take away from the context. It doesn't take away from the content or the user experience. It improves it. And a lot of people don't even bother looking at those AAA success criteria, even though there are a handful of them that are pretty easy to satisfy, that would, for some users, dramatically increase the user experience.
Yeah, I've done that before, taken some of the copy and run it through a tool to see just what reading level it's at. As a general rule, we don't do that, and the reason is because the majority of the sites that we actually test, we usually find enough basic issues at a high enough number that we don't want to overload the client. So he's like, okay, they wanted us to do this testing, we're not going to spend any longer, because we want to waste their resources. And the fact is, they need to go back and actually make their site. They need to fix those general issues before they start getting into some of those more detailed ones. But you are right. One of the level 3 or AAA issues that I often do comment on is link text. Because you have doesn't make sense out of context, basically, and that's such an easy one to implement. And so if I have a site where they're getting pretty much everything right, but they're kind of missing that in a way, I often will give them that guidance, because it is a low-hanging fruit.
So getting into the developer having to, or the designer having to go back and fix all of that stuff, in your opinion, you can rate it on a scale. How difficult is it to fix a lot of those issues that you're finding in those audits?
Boy, like I said, most of the issues we find are pretty basic initially. So they're usually not that difficult to fix, unless what we're looking at is part of a CMS system, or some other kind of system that's not owned by the client. Right? In which case they have, their level of access to and control over the code is really what it comes down to. But if they have full control of the site, fixing a form label or, contrast and things like that, most of those issues are really easy to fix.
Yeah.
It's rare that we have the really difficult ones,
Yeah. Well, there's your confidence boost. Making your website accessible from Jeff himself is not that hard. It's not that difficult.
The hard part is understanding what the issue is in the first place and identifying it, you know. And then
100%.
when it comes to fixing it, if you, once somebody tells you, I'll just add this ARIA attribute, or remove this thing over here, or a lot of the issues I see is, which I've been seeing a lot lately over the last few months, is controls that are assigned different ARIA attributes. So I'll get a control that's read out as a checkbox and a radio button and a list. And it's like, okay, what is it? And it's because they've added a lot of different ARIA tags or different role attributes, different parts of that code. And it's like, if you just take all that out, then it works fine.
Yeah, just use standard HTML.
Yeah.
So my last question for you, another pretty popular topic, going back to the automated testing tools, because I've seen, you mentioned that with some sites, you don't need to necessarily turn on a screen reader. And I see that conversation popping up more and more, that to test a website, to make it accessible, you don't necessarily need to test it with 2 or 3 different screen readers. You don't need to run a color contrast analyzer on it. So those tools that are out there, your Axis, your Andes, your Waves, your Lighthouses, your WebAIMs, what is sort of your take, and what guidance do you give people when it comes to, say, somebody that's relatively new to the accessibility conversation, and they're seeing tools that are saying WCAG conformance in minutes and things like that? What is your guidance when it comes to navigating that whole AI, automated machine learning sort of conversation around accessibility?
Sure. So as far as the tools that implement AI, I think they're on the right track. I don't think we're there yet, because there's still a lot of guesswork going on when it comes to AI. And there's still a lot of things that you have to look at with your own eyes to make a judgment call, like for alt text. Yeah, I know that there's AI out there that can, figure out what an image might be and provide some alt text, but most of the time that's not really, the alt text that is generated for that image. Does it really apply to the content that you're presenting on the page? There is that, you have to have that continuity there. So I don't rely on AI myself in that way. I do have some high hopes that we might get there one day, but we're not there yet. And then as far as you mentioned somebody that might be new to accessibility in general, one of the things I provide guidance for those individuals is don't go immediately to a scanning tool. And the reason being is because, as we mentioned earlier, scanning tools can generate a lot of false positives, where it says this is an issue, when once the page is rendered, it's not really an issue. And you can get even if it truly is an issue, you can get a lot of issues that overall don't impact the end user, the accessibility of the site. So they might prevent you from conforming with WCAG, but that issue itself doesn't really impact anybody. And so if you get thousands of those issues, the tendency is, oh, look at all this, we have to go in and fix this. And now you're dumping all these resources into fixing things that ultimately don't have a huge return, other than the scanning tool might pass. And really, it's not so much that we're looking to conform with the WCAG guidelines, which obviously there's a good reason to do that, but ultimately we want to make sure that our websites are accessible. And for that reason, I always encourage those that are new to accessibility to start out with some manual testing. And by doing the manual testing, they become much more informed, and it's easier for them to understand why these guidelines in there, what they're talking about, and how it actually impacts a user. Because if you're just relying on a scanning tool, you don't get that. You don't understand what somebody who might be low vision or blind or whatever, mobility impaired, the effort that they might have to go through to do that. And so by taking that manual approach, you're going to find those, as long as you understand what you're doing, you're going to find those issues that truly impact users. And those are the ones you should fix, because you can have a site that's ultimately accessible, but still not, meet WCAG, and that's one of the keys. And that's one of the things we did in WebAlign too, is for each of those success criteria, we outline how do you go about testing it without assistive technology so that you can validate it, because some of the stuff is hard to make sense of if you've never dealt with it before. So yeah, that's my biggest, I think, advice for people that are new is don't go straight to a scanning tool. Scanning tools have their places, but you got to do the manual testing first.
Well, and to that point, like these tools are just going to get better the more the large language models learn and are taught and all of that kind of stuff. But I always sort of lead off that conversation is accessibility is for people. You can't take the people out of accessibility.
Right.
Because we're not making our websites accessible for ChatGPT. We're making it accessible for our customers, our clients, our partners. And without having a person in that conversation, sitting at that table, making those decisions, testing and evaluating, giving feedback, like focus groups in the marketing landscape have been around for hundreds of years or whatever. Like there's a reason businesses talk to their customers to get feedback to make their products and services better. Accessibility is no different.
Right. And then using things like a screen reader also, you know, it's great if you can use them. But to your point is if you don't truly put yourself in the position of the user and all you're hearing is the screen reader read something out and you see the text on the screen, the assumption is, oh, it's working.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to it than that. You have to make sure you're getting all that information that is going to help you do what you need to do if all you have to rely on is just that audible feedback. You know, and most testers that use screen readers, I find, have a difficult time getting into that mindset.
Agreed. There's a lot to unpack within the accessibility space, and that's why we're having these conversations. Ken and I talked about physical and digital accessibility and the gap between them. Assistive technology is another huge conversation. JAWS just updated yesterday as of the time of recording this. So there's new features and corrective techniques and all kinds of things happening. The assistive technology world is updating just as fast as a new iPhone is coming out. It's updating as fast as a new update for Windows comes out. So it's not, the gap between the technology and the assistive technology is not getting any bigger, nor is it necessarily getting any smaller at a rapid rate, but definitely a world to dive in and have a conversation about. So thank you, Jeff, for jumping on, having a conversation, talking about accessibility, automated testing, and giving some insights and some advice on how people can take that first step into the accessibility world. So appreciate your time and thank you.
No, you're welcome. I'm always happy to talk about accessibility.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I think that will do it for this one. We will wrap it up here and we will see you in the next one.
Sounds good. Stop.